day. Thanks for listening. Now, no doubt you've heard the news. We are mobilizing for the possibility of war with Russia. Yeah, you heard that correctly. And maybe you think, well, of course we're mobilizing to be ready to fight Vladimir Putin's war machine if we have to. And if you do think that, you may well be right. Anyone who doesn't recognize the clear and present danger to Europe from Putin's aggressive and expansionist rhetoric surely hasn't been paying attention. But it raises all sorts of questions that we're talking them through on today's programmes. Will Operation Mobilise, and yeah, there is always a code 9, will it mean enough for the role of the UK and European forces? What will it mean for the new balance of power in Europe and the world? What would it mean for politics in our country and the relationships between the United Kingdom and the UK's allies and adversaries around the globe? Going to be talking that through, talking in a moment to a former senior British military commander to get General Tim Cross's thoughts. And a bit later on Drive, the Scottish National Party, the government in Edinburgh is gearing up for a fresh push to break with and break up the United Kingdom. But what are the chances of that actually happening? And will the Scots be put off by the kind of border disputes, for example, that still fill the air in Northern Ireland 6 years after Brexit? What about the implications for the currency and for public debt? The SNP's finance spokesman at Westminster is joining me live here in the studio. Now, people have been commenting on Britain's defence commitments on the Times digital edition. Here is one contribution. Billions more in military spending when the country is facing 10% inflation and a cost of living crisis. But Richard responds, tax rises. Now, why could that possibly be? It's almost like there's war in Europe and a surge in living costs and the aftershocks of a pandemic to take into account. Well, tell me what you think. Join in this conversation. Send me a text, 87222, start with the word Times, or send me an email to studio@times.radio or a tweet to @timesradio. So let's just recap on where we are. Boris Johnson now set to increase defence spending by billions. The PM under pressure now from ministers to combat the threat from Russia, and he's at the NATO summit in Madrid today. The Chief of the General Staff, Patrick Sanders, compared the current climate to the pre-World War II years.
This is our 1937 moment. We're not at war, but we must act rapidly so that we aren't drawn into one through a failure to contain territorial expansion.
The Defence Secretary, Ben Wallace, told the Royal United Services Institute's Land Warfare Conference earlier today that the objective of the government's Operation Mobilise was to be the ruthless prioritisation of readiness and relevance.
We must always be ready to fight, wherever positioned and whichever domain, and in doing so contain the Kremlin's aggression, because it is increasingly clear that President Putin cannot be deterred by threat of punishment or the costs imposed upon his people.
So we welcome here in the studio Major General Tim Cross, retired British Army officer, military logistics expert. Tim, good afternoon.
John,
good to see you here in the flesh, in the studio.
Indeed.
So what are your thoughts on this then Tim? It's we're talking about a big increase in public spending, but then we're talking about a huge mission, something which will deter Russian aggression at a time when Russia and Vladimir Putin is in a very, very aggressive mood. And we're talking about defending a very, very broad frontier across NATO's eastern flank. Yeah. So with that in mind, is this kind of spending up to the case?
Well, I mean, both your commenters talking about public spending and the cost of living crisis and so forth, in a way, this couldn't have come at a worse time. But what we're going back to, I mean, notwithstanding the comment about 1937, we're also going back in a way to the Cold War years. And when we talk about deterrence, that's what the Cold War was all about. And if you're going to deter a major adversary like Russia, in those days the Soviet Union, you do need to be able to spend on your military capabilities, and you need to have a credible deterrence. And the reality is, I mean, I don't say this aggressively in any sense, because the reality of what we've gone through in the last 20 years, and in the last few years in particular, through various crises, is that defence spending has fallen substantially. And the British Army, for example, an army I joined one way or another back in 1964, so I go back a while, but, was several 100,000 strong, the British forces in those days. British Army is now only about 82,000. And when we look at those days in the Cold War, we were part of a NATO alliance that in the northern part of what was then West Germany, a divided Germany, we had a Northern Army group with a British Army Corps, a Dutch Corps, a Belgian Corps, and a German Corps. And they were each about 60,000 strong. So we're not going to go back to that sort of scale. So one of the questions that comes out of these conversations and the speeches that are being made is, at what scale do we think we're going to need to fight the Russians? Over what period of time? How are we going to deter them? And if we fail to deter them, to quote the CGS, we need to be able to defeat them. Not we, the British, but we, the alliance, together. So that means we will have to increase defence spending. My own personal view, and I suppose I would say this, wouldn't I? But I think the size of the army needs to go back up. It was over 100,000 not that long ago. And we're looking at countries like Germany who've committed themselves to increasing their defence spending substantially. But that is not going to happen quickly. You have to recruit, you have to equip, you have to train your soldiers, and you have to prepare them for, potential serious high-intensity warfighting.
So the force we're talking about putting into place between this country and NATO allies clearly has to be capable, yes, of winning a land engagement with a powerful enemy, but also to be strong enough to prevent that enemy from even thinking about stepping onto NATO territory. Yeah. So it needs to be so formidable that Vladimir Putin in his most expansionist moments would think, I'm not even going to go there. I mean, the sorts of spending we're talking about, does it do that?
Well, it depends how you spend the money, of course. And to be fair, in the review that went on a couple of years ago, the argument that you move to much higher technology forces, unmanned capability, particularly in the air and on naval forces as well, does make a difference. So we have to be clear how we spend this money. But this deterrence business is something that we collectively understood well back in the 70s and 80s. When I say that, I mean we, the military, academics in this country and in America and elsewhere, and indeed politicians. Now, in those days, we had forward deployed forces, large forces in place in Germany that could be deployed at very high readiness. I mean, when I commanded my own company and battalion in Germany, we had to be able to get out of our barracks within 2 hours, literally 2 hours, into pre-planned defensive positions in order to, if necessary, to defend ourselves against the Warsaw Pact incursion. So in all of this debate, it's not just about numbers, it's about an ability to, where are you going to deploy these forces to? If they're going to be back in the UK, have you got the capability to deploy them quickly to Eastern Europe? And can you sustain them over a long period of time? Because deterrence, hopefully, it means you're not going to be into an immediate fight. You're going to deter the fight. So you've got to sustain that force, both in terms of equipment, and you can't keep people at very high readiness for very long periods of time.
It is a huge commitment.
It is a very big commitment.
So in my time as a politics watcher, and that's really quite a long time, I've lost count of the number of times I've reported and discussed on stories of the Ministry of Defence and its procurement department wasting enormous sums of money, just eye-watering sums of money, on elementary blunders in procurement, whether projects were late in arriving or when they did arrive, they just didn't work and they were never the right projects in the first place. The record of the MOD in many cases is not encouraging.
No, that's true, and there are examples of that today with the armoured fighting vehicle that the Army have been trying to procure for a long time. Now, I don't rush to the defence of our procurement agency, which is based in the West Country in Bristol, but actually compared to many, we're not that bad. These are very complex programs. One of the problems is that we collectively, as time rolls on, as you're procuring these equipments, you try to put additional stuff into them to make them very relevant, latest technology, etc. So we overcomplicate that process in many regards. Some of the programs have been extremely successful, it has to be said. And if you look at the numbers in terms of percentages, actually, the percentage of the programs that are produced by the procurement executive are pretty positive. But the big players, the high capital assets, big money programs that catch the headlines, there's no doubt we've fallen short. But I would say, these are good people trying to make the right decisions. They're not deliberately trying to, muck things about. They are genuinely trying to get the right decisions. They're working in a very complex area. So, it goes wrong occasionally. And that's why I go back to my earlier point. Germany may say that they're going to spend an awful lot of money. You don't spend it quickly. You have to have the right kit. And procuring that equipment takes time.
And just briefly, because forgive me, because it doesn't beg a brief answer, but how confident can this country be in its allies? I mean, there are question marks over some countries, including Germany, and even America. Joe Biden seems committed to this joint challenge, but backing it up a long term, that's another matter. There could be a change of government in the United States. Donald Trump, when he was in office, raised big questions about even being a member of NATO. Is that in the heading of things you can't worry about because you can't control them?
Well, from a military point of view, you can't worry about it because you can't control it. But I don't think there's any doubt that when you look at the issue that we're dealing with at the moment is how long are we prepared collectively to sustain this commitment? And when we hit the autumn and the winter and the issue of energy prices and gas prices, etc., there is no doubt, notwithstanding what was said at the G7 and notwithstanding what's been promised at Madrid, there are countries, and I would include Germany and France and Italy amongst them, whose resolution in resilience for a long period of time, I have to say, I for one certainly would question that. There are others like the Baltic states and Poland, which are clearly going to, hold fire on this for a long, long period of time because they're the ones under threat.
Maybe that's in the nature of alliances.
Well, absolutely, it is in the nature of alliances. That's just the way it is, I'm afraid.
All right. Major General Tim Cross, great to talk to you. Thanks for coming in. Let's talk again soon.
Not at all.
Now, coming up in a moment, I'm going to be talking to the Scottish National Party after Nicola Sturgeon, First Minister of Scotland, announced that she's going to be holding an independence referendum for Scotland in October of next year. It's 5:16. I'm John Pienaar. This is Drive on Times Radio in association with Nutmeg. Invest your way with the UK's largest digital wealth manager. And as with all investing, your capital's at